Hey guys, welcome back to Twisted Willow. Today we're going to be making some of my homemade bread. This recipe I developed from a combination of other bread recipes that I've tried, and I will post a copy of the recipe in the description. I'm just reusing a bowl that I used for a different bread recipe, and I've placed it on my scale and I'm going to zero it out. And I'm making a double batch here because I'd like an extra loaf to keep in the freezer. We're going to start with some non-chlorinated filtered water. I'm using cold water because I'm using instant yeast. Next, we're going to add the yeast and we're going to sprinkle that over the surface of the water. And next, we're going to add some sourdough starter. This is totally optional. If you don't have sourdough starter or don't want to add sourdough starter to this bread recipe, you can absolutely leave it out. And next, we're going to add some honey. I have a great source for some local raw honey and it tastes fantastic in the bread. And now we're going to give it a good stir. We're going to try to get all the ingredients combined as best we can. The honey can be a little bit difficult, but just do the best you can. Then we're going to add our flour. I try to get the flour as evenly distributed on the bowl as I can so that when we add the salt won't touch the yeast and kill the yeast or the sourdough starter. And then I'm going to take my spoon and just smooth out the flour and make sure that the yeast underneath is very well protected. Next, I'm going to add the salt. I use pink Himalayan salt. It's okay to use iodized salt when making bread, and I just try to distribute it as evenly through the flour as possible. And then we're going to stir everything all in together. You just want this to come together so that everything looks well combined. We're going to give this lots of time to rise, so that's really going to do all the work of kneading for us. So this is virtually a no-knead bread. We're going to do some stretch and folds just to develop the gluten, but that's it. For me to constantly have fresh baked bread, homemade bread in the house, it has to be really simple, and so I've developed this recipe so that is super easy. It only takes me about 10 minutes of hands-on time to get this bread together. And once you get in the habit of making this bread often, it just becomes so simple. So we're going to cover this and let it rest for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, we're going to remove the cover and we're going to do our stretch and folds. We're going to grab the edges of the dough and pull it towards the center, and we're going to keep turning the bowl and doing this, pulling it in on itself until we've made it all the way around the dough ball. You can feel the dough starting to firm up as you do this, and performing a stretch and fold will allow us to develop the gluten strands in the dough. We're going to cover this again and we're going to let it rest on the counter for 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, we're going to pull the cover off and we're going to perform another stretch and fold. Again, just going all the way around the dough, making sure that all of the edges have been folded in on itself. And you can really see the difference after the first stretch and fold that this is really coming together as a much smoother and silkier dough. Again, we'll cover and let it rest for another 15 minutes. We'll remove the cover and perform our last stretch and fold. I have many times forgotten about this dough on the counter and had much longer than 15 minutes between my stretch and folds, sometimes forgetting about it for a few hours. And in that case, I've just performed a single stretch and fold and thrown this in the fridge, and it has turned out just fine. So no worries if you make a mistake, this recipe is very forgiving. We're going to cover and we're going to let this rest for another 15 minutes. After the 15 minutes, we're going to place this in the fridge. If you chose not to use the sourdough starter, you'll keep this in the fridge for 12 to 24 hours. If you did use the sourdough starter, you can keep this in the fridge for anywhere from 12 hours to about 5 days. I prefer 3 to 5 days as it allows the bread to develop a lot more flavor. It's really nice to have such flexible time constraints because I basically always have a bowl of bread dough ready to bake in my fridge at all times. We're going to make sure our countertop is clean and we are going to dust the surface with flour. And then we're going to turn the dough out onto the floured surface. And dust the top side of the dough with some all-purpose flour. I like to flip the dough over a time or two and just make sure that there's a good coating of flour. We don't want this sticking to our countertop. Next, we're going to start stretching this out into a big rectangle, and we want to even out the thickness of the dough throughout so that we can cut this into portions. So I'm doing more stretching and not so much pushing because I don't want to lose the air bubbles that have developed in this dough. So I'll be portioning out this batch of dough into 2 larger loaves. I very often will portion this out into 4 smaller loaves, or even further portion it even smaller to make some baguettes. So I'm just cutting this with a bench knife into 2 roughly equal sized portions. And I'm just going to roll this up into a log shape, and I'm going to press the edges together, the seams together. I'll be using a couple of bannetons, so I'm going to be making one oval loaf and one round loaf. So I've already shaped the round loaf. I didn't get footage of that, but it's basically the same thing, just instead of a log, you would shape it into a round. And if you don't have a banneton basket to shape these loaves in, that's okay. You can just make them into whatever shape you like and just leave them on a cookie sheet lined with parchment to rise. Once you're happy with your shape, you can flour your banneton so that the bread doesn't stick, or like I said, just line a baking sheet with some parchment and just lay your loaves on that and cover with a towel to allow them to rise for 1 hour. This is my round loaf here. I'm just dusting a little extra flour. I'm just going to place this in the banneton seam side up, just like the other loaf. And I'm going to cover these with a clean dish towel and let them rise for 1 hour. About halfway through the rise time, I will preheat the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. I use a bread pan and fill it half full of water and place it in a lower rack to create steam while the oven preheats. After the full 1 hour of rise time, we uncover these and we see that they've risen nicely. We are now going to get a parchment lined baking sheet, and we are going to just drop these out of the bannetons onto the parchment. If you chose not to use bannetons and you let your loaves rise on a parchment lined baking sheet, then you've done this step already. Next, we're going to score our loaves. I like to do a few passes on mine to cut them nice and deep. I find that I get a little bit better rise out of it. That way it doesn't bust out the side on me. I like to keep my designs relatively simple, but you can do whatever you like, whatever works for you. I know people like really pretty designs in their bread, and that's totally doable with this recipe. If you don't have one of these official bread lames, which is basically just a razor blade, I found that using a ceramic knife worked really well for scoring my bread as well. This was a gift, a Christmas gift from a cousin of mine who is a baker, so since I have it, I like to use it, and it works really, really well. Scoring the bread like this gives you control over where the bread will rise. If you were to not score these loaves at all, they would rise and they would just split and kind of burst open, and you would have some kind of wonky shaped loaves, which is totally fine, but I know we all like to have a nice looking loaf at the end. These loaves are now ready for the oven, so I'm going to place them in my 500 degree preheated oven. You can see my little bread pan full of water. That creates the steam to allow the bread to rise. We're going to let that bake for 15 minutes at 500. After 15 minutes, we're going to come back and we're going to lower the temperature of the oven to 450, and we're going to bake for another 15 minutes. And when you pull your bread out, you'll want to transfer to a wire rack to cool for 1 hour before slicing. And here is our finished product, sliced 1 hour after baking, has a nice dispersion of air bubbles. Thanks for following along with me today. See you next time.